think, and the meaning of life, Chapter 9. James opens the back door for us again, even though I tell him I can open it. He has the package in front of him, so once again we have no idea where we are going, or what we are supposed to do when we get there. I search my backpack for any stray candy to bring me comfort, but I'm all out. I hold out my hand to Lizzie, palm up. Starburst, please. Flavor? Lizzie asks, digging the back out of her pocket. Red, I reply. I want to ask why she didn't offer earlier, but I don't. Pick your battles, Dad always said. As the limo heads into parts unknown, we amuse ourselves by pressing the button to open and close the window. Then we look outside to count how many people turn their heads as the limousine passes them. Once that gets old, I wrap the box in bubble wrap, and I can't help popping the bubbles. Lizzie jumps every time. I then polish off 1.5 peanut butter sandwiches while Lizzie eats a soy and cheese spinach wrap that her dad made her. I can't even watch. We're about to turn on the TV when the car comes to a halt, and the window divider lowers. We're here, James says over his shoulder. Are you ready? What should we be ready for? Lizzie asks. I'm not getting out of the car until you tell us. I take my hand away from the door handle and sit back in my seat. James twists around till he is facing us. You will be delivering a package, that's all. I lean forward. Why does Mr. Oswald need us to do this? Not to be rude, but why couldn't you or someone else who already works for him do it? James smiles. His teeth are very white. Because I do not have a debt to society to pay. Oh, please, Lizzie says with a wave of her hand. That's a big misunderstanding. James raises the window divider, and we hear him get out of the car. I'm about to open my door when Lizzie puts her hand on my arm. Her mouth opens to say something, but then she closes it again. What is it? I ask. Nothing, she says as James opens her door. She turns away and steps out. I slide over the seat and follow. I know she's nervous about what we're going to find here, but she'd never admit it. I have no problem admitting it. You can leave your bag in the car, James instructs me. You won't be needing it. I hesitate. If Dad's box gets stolen, I would never forgive myself. It will be safe, I promise, James says. Not wanting to make a big deal out of it, I shrug the bag off my shoulder and leave it on the seat. Then I quickly move it from the seat to the floor, thinking it's less likely to be seen there. I close the door tightly behind me and find Lizzie leaning against the car, tapping her finger on tinted windows. Okay, so I guess my bag will be safe. James makes a big show of clicking on the alarm. We follow James a few doors down and find ourselves in front of the tall apartment building, the kind with a door and a doorman. James hands me a package. I hand it to Lizzie, who promptly hands it back to me. The doorman tips his hat at us, and we follow James into the building and up to the desk where a security guard is reading the newspaper. James clears his throat and says, We are here to see Miss Mabel Bingsley. She is expecting us. The guard lazily lays his paper down on the counter and picks up a phone. He presses 3 numbers. And you're all here? And you all are, James says. You may tell Miss Bingsley that we are representatives of Mr. Oswald. The guard mumbles, Oh, may I? And presses 1 more number. James pretends not to hear the guard's comment, but I'm sure he did. The guard relays the message and then hangs up. Okay, you can go. We step into the elevator and James presses 14. Lizzie says, It would have been the 14th floor. Again. What's wrong with the 14th floor? James asks. You don't want to know, Lizzie says with a shiver. I ask, why would anyone want an old book on woodland animals anyway? Lizzie shrugs. Maybe it's an antique. James here, although a man of few words, did say Mr. Oswald sold antiques. Suddenly, her eyes widen and she adds, Unless it's not really a book at all. Interesting, I say, considering his theory. Mr. Oswald did shut the book pretty quickly, so I couldn't get a good look at it. You're right. It could be a hollowed-out book with money, or jewels, or a treasure map hidden inside. Yes, Lizzie says, grabbing my arm. That's why Mr. Oswald wants us to deliver it. As minors, we wouldn't get into as much trouble as an adult would. Maybe he's connected to the mob. We stare accusingly at James. Lizzie does her best hands on her hips glare. James shakes his head and rolls his eyes. It's a book, he says firmly. The elevator opens and James steps out. Lizzie and I don't move. It's a book, he says even more firmly. The doors start to close and he has to stick his foot in to get them to bounce back open. We might as well go with him, I say to Lizzie. Mr. Oswald doesn't really seem like the kind of guy who would set us up. I guess not, she admits. We step out of the elevator and James walks down the hallway, a few steps ahead of us. This sure is different from our apartment building. Air conditioning in the halls for one, and carpet that doesn't have any stains. I run my hand along the patterned wallpaper. No dust. There are chairs and a little table every few feet, so neighbors can chat, I guess. Here we are, James says, stopping in front of 14G. You're on your own. I'll be waiting out here. Sure, so we can deliver the contraband, Lizzie mumbles, while you keep a safe distance. It's a book, James insists, heading toward a chair a few doors down. Neither of us makes a move to knock. Finally, I shift the page under my arm and ring the buzzer. A few seconds later, the door creaks open, and an elderly woman in a light pink dress stands before us. She is wearing a thin gold necklace with 2 intertwined hearts hanging from it. Her watery blue eyes are almost see-through. She stands very straight. Addressing me, she says, I didn't expect Mr. Oswald to be so young. Then she steps aside to let us enter. She closes the door behind us, unknowingly leaving James out in the hall. We're on our own now. The apartment is smaller than I would have thought, but has a big window with a wide view. We must be on the Upper East Side because I can see the East River. I've got to start paying more attention in the limo. I'm not Mr. Oswald, I tell her. My name is Jeremy Fink, and this is Lizzie Molden. Mabel Bingsley, she says, holding out her hand. In the sunlight that streams in through the window, she seems even older. Her skin looks paper thin. I'm afraid to shake her hand too hard because she has surprisingly strong grip. So, what brings you to my humble abode? Lizzie and I exchange worried glances. Don't you know? Asks Lizzie. Miss Bingsley shakes her head. I hold out the package. Did you order this for Mr. Oswald? The antique dealer? Antiques? She repeats. No, I haven't bought antiques in years. She leans in like she's going to tell us a secret. Truth be told, they give me the creeps. I like that she's not talking to us like we're little kids. So you don't know what this is? I ask and hand her the package. She shakes her head again and says, Why don't we find out? She leads us through the living room and into the small kitchen, resting the box on the kitchen table. She pulls out a knife from the drawer. She neatly slices through the tape, then pushes the sides of the box. The whole thing is very reminiscent of us opening the package with my dad's box in it. Except this time, I know what's inside. Even if Miss Bingsley doesn't. She reaches in and pulls out the small book. She turns it around in her hands and tentatively opens the front cover. She reads something written there, then closes it up again, hugging it tight to her chest. When she looks up, her eyes are full of tears. But they are shining, too. Where did you get this? She whispers. We told you, Lizzie says. Mr. Oswald asked us to deliver it. We sort of work for him. She stares at us blankly, and then her eyes focus abruptly, and she's back up a step. Old Ozzy? No, that's not possible. Why, he'd have to be 120 years old by now. I may not be great at figuring out how old adults are, but I'm pretty sure Mr. Oswald isn't any older than 70 or 75. Definitely younger than Miss Bingsley. I shake my head. I think he's only in his 70s, and I can't imagine anyone calling him Ozzy. Lizzie nods in agreement. Miss Bingsley looks down at the book and says in a shaky voice, How much do I owe you for this? Lizzie and I look at each other alarmed. Mr. Oswald never said anything about collecting payment. Nothing? I reply uncertainly. But Miss Bingsley no longer seems to be paying attention to us. She keeps rubbing her hands across the cover of the book. Abruptly, she walks out of the kitchen and sits down on the couch in the living room. Lizzie leans close and whispers, Should we leave now? I don't know, I whisper back. I'm not sure what's going on. Me either. She sure seems to like that book, though. I nod. But why doesn't she remember ordering it? She's really, really old, Lizzie suggests. I don't think that's it. Let's go find out, Lizzie says. We slip into the living room and each take a chair opposite of the woman. Miss Bingsley, Lizzie asks, Are you okay? Miss Bingsley looks up from the book lying open on her lap. I notice that the envelope that I had picked up from Mr. Oswald's office floor is on the cushion at her side. She smiles and asks, Would you like to hear my favorite part? I find it hard to believe someone has a favorite part in a book on woodland animals. Without waiting for our answer, she starts to read. Later on, when they had all said goodbye and thank you to Christopher Robin, Pooh and Piglet walked home thoughtfully together in the golden evening, and for a long time they were silent. Lizzie jumps up from her chair. Woodland animals, she snorts. That's Winnie the Pooh! Shh, I tell her, pulling her back down. Let her finish. Miss Bingsley continues. When you wake up in the morning, Pooh, said Piglet at last, what's the first thing you say to yourself? What's for breakfast? Said Pooh. What do you say, Piglet? I say, I wonder what's going to happen exciting today, said Piglet. Pooh nodded thoughtfully. It's the same thing, he said. Miss Bingsley stops reading, but doesn't lift her head. Why hadn't Mr. Oswald told us the book was Winnie the Pooh? The whole thing doesn't make sense. Suddenly I realized something that should have been obvious from the minute she took out the book. Miss Bingsley, I said, did this book once belong to you? She doesn't answer at first, only runs her hand over the page. Then she says, it was only half mine. The other half belonged to my best friend Bitsy. You mean Betsy? Lizzie suggests. Miss Bingsley shakes her head. Bitsy. Bitsy Solomon. People had funny names back then, Lizzie comments. I glare at Lizzie. Go on, I urge Miss Bingsley. She sighs gently and says, I haven't spoken to Bitsy in over 65 years. But you said she's your best friend, Lizzie says. I misspoke, Miss Bingsley replies calmly. I notice her left hand is shaking slightly. She sees me looking and quickly puts her other hand on top of it, just as quickly. I look away. Sorry that I saw it in the first place. 65 years is like an eternity. The longest Lizzie and I ever went without speaking was a week, and that was because she said the things on Star Trek couldn't really happen. Bitsy used to be my friend, Miss Bingsley explained, until I sold this book for a fancy dress. She confronted me, but I told her I hadn't taken it. I knew she knew I had. Best friends always know when the other's lying. For years I wanted to apologize, but I was too embarrassed. I don't get it, Lizzie says. How could you buy a whole dress for the cost of a book? Miss Bingsley opens the front cover and turns it around to face us. We lean closer to read the faded handwriting. To Bitsy and Mabel, Pooh's biggest American fans. Best regards, A. Milne. Oh, Lizzie says. Wow, I say. Old Ozzie gave me $20 for it. Back then in the 30s, that was near a fortune for a child. I still think she must be confused about Mr. Oswald, since there's no way our Mr. Oswald have bought this book from her. I don't have the nerve to tell her she's wrong, though. Lizzie, as usual, has no problem coming up with something to say. Why'd you need this dress so badly? She asks. Miss Bingsley closes her eyes. For a few minutes she doesn't answer. I'm starting to squirm. Did she fall asleep? Lizzie pinches me on the arm and mouths, What should we do? I'm about to answer that maybe we should go when Miss Bingsley opens her eyes and reaches for the old envelope. It's all in here, she says, pushing the letter back into the envelope and holding it out to me. Will you do me a favor and read it later? I'd like to be alone. I stick the envelope in my back pocket of my shorts, and for the first time in my life, I wish I had worn something less sloppy. Will your husband be home soon? Lizzie asks. I hear something unusual in her voice. Genuine concern. She shakes her head and looks over at a faded wedding photo on the coffee table. No, Richard isn't around anymore. How did you two meet? Lizzie asks. My first thought is that I wish Lizzie would stop pressuring her to answer these questions, but I quickly realize what she's doing. She's keeping Miss Bingsley talking in that hopes when we leave it won't feel so abrupt. I met him the night I wore that dress, she says wistfully. I was 16. She raises her hand to her throat and rubs the little hearts hanging from her necklace. It's a total unconscious thing. I think she'd be surprised to know she was doing it. She continues. Bitsy never even seen him before. She would have been my maid of honor. That's so sad, Lizzie says. Her comment snaps Miss Bingsley out of her reverie, and she pushes herself up from the couch. Now I'm sure you two have better things to do than spend a summer afternoon with an old lady. Without actually pushing us, she nevertheless herds us toward the door. You tell Ozzie that I thank him from the bottom of my heart. But Mr. Oswald isn't, Lizzie begins. I interrupt her and say, We will! She closes the door behind us, and we're back in the fancy hallway. Neither of us says anything for a moment. James comes up behind us and says, How did it go? I can't think of a word that would be suitable for a reply. Lizzie just says, Mr. Oswald has a lot of explaining to do tomorrow, and storms off of the elevator. James, I say as we follow behind. Does anyone call Mr. Oswald Ozzy? He shakes his head and smiles. Does he seem like an Ozzy to you? No. As the elevator door closes, he says, Old Ozzy was what they called his grandfather.